Convener. I took the train, and the class was called "What is a Text?" And it was very interesting because at that time, 20 years ago, people were trying to figure out what was a text. And it was really hard for Rhae Chartier to include texts about other texts that are not books in the syllabus, right? Like he was literally invited us to think beyond the page of a book. But I remember him saying that it was difficult to find materials because people were not still beyond the page at that time. So I'm glad to see that, 20 years later, we have a book like this one that's literally responding what is a text.
And his name is on it. He's
Yeah,
on the editorial board.
He was the editor, right? He's the editor of the board.
Yeah.
And so that's amazing. It just tells that this field is growing and expanding, and I'm glad that you invited us to be part of this. I think it was like 2019 or 2018 that you invited me to be part of like one small pilot workshop where we talk about our objects, and then it started to expand and it just became this book. So it's great to see this realization of things. I'm just going to present the authors today in the order that we're going to be talking about. The idea is to have an exercise of sharing with you and among ourselves our objects and what do we do with them, or what we did with them. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A questions. If there are questions from the morning session that were not answered by the people in the morning session, you're welcome to bring those questions to this session as well. So I'll start with Lynn Barnes. She's a assistant professor at Princeton University. She's the co-editor of this wonderful volume. She's a cultural historian. She's a historian, public speaker, writer, editor, documentarian. Speaking about the beyond the page, she specializes in the globalization of American popular culture and American music. She has been focusing on the history of racism, the history of white supremacy, racial formation, gender, sexuality, book history, and material culture. Second, we have Professor Marlena Cravens. She's assistant professor of instruction in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at UT at Austin. She couldn't be here today because I think she's in New Jersey or Delaware. But she specializes in the history of language and conquest in the Americas, 1492, 1650. Then we have Professor Lori Dio. She's a Kay and Belma Kimball Endowed Chair, professor in art history at Texas Christian University. She specializes in Mesoamerican and she specializes in art and Asian American art, Mesoamerica and South America in particular, the art of Mexico. She has published extensively on the Codex Mexicanus. I was looking at your bibliography, and that's amazing, and other Mesoamerican texts. Then we have Professor Alex Hidalgo. He's an associate professor of Latin American history at Texas Christian University. He specializes in Mesoamerican ethnohistory, manuscript and print culture, history of collecting, as sound. And I just mentioned to him that we read his article, the one that he published in the Hispanic American Historical Review like 2 years ago with the joint issue with William and Mary, which is about soundscapes during the conquest. And we read it for a graduate class. So if you have any questions, he's here. It's always good to see the author and see his face. And he also works on the history of cartography, and recently you're working on this book on the soundscapes in Mesoamerica?
In Mexico City.
Okay, Mexico City. Then we have our well-known Professor Santiago Muñoz Arbeláez. He's assistant professor in our department at UT. His research and teaching focuses on interactions between indigenous peoples and European empires in early modern Atlantic world. He has like an interdisciplinary angle where he combines material culture with agrarian history and the history of books and maps. And last but not least, I'm here. You all know me, associate professor here at UT, and I work on networks of communication and information in the Spanish Caribbean during the Age of Revolutions. I have asked our contributors to also not only think about their texts, but also think about other questions that have to do, like, for example, how they connect what they do with the history of books. How did this particular project contribute to the way they see their own research questions? How this project changed the way that you see text or books or printed materials in your own work? What do you think? I think this is an important question. What are the methodological challenges you encountered when you were working on these texts or objects? If you have any advice to share with your graduate students, and if you want to reflect also on the kind of challenges of working or not with digital collections, what is good or bad of using digital collections. These are questions that, again, are not mandatory, just for us to explore our objects or texts. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, well, welcome back. First thing I want to say is I am representing a duo, previously a trio. So this book is co-edited between myself and Professor Glenda Goodman, who is an associate professor. She's a musicologist and a historian of the book in early America at the University of Pennsylvania. And I still don't know to this day how I conned her into helping me with this. Originally, I was working with Aaron Hyman, who's an art historian who does Latin America, and our original plan, as I convinced him one night, was I would do North America, he would do Latin America. And then we just realized, like, this is too unwieldy. We're doing so many different disciplines. We need someone who does sound as well, because of some of the things that were discussed this morning about the ways in which orality and print work together. And Glenda came on. Erin unfortunately had to leave, but she stuck with it. And miraculously, I think we actually have 60 contributors over 48 chapters. And with the exception of one or two people, because of COVID reasons, people stuck with this project for almost 5 years, which is amazing. And it drug out that long because of the publisher, not us. So I just want to acknowledge that this book is the product of really almost 100 people contributing in different ways, in different forms, whether that's through institutional support, intellectual support, editing, etc. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my very early interest in this. I'm going to talk about the quilt, and then just some of the broader themes of the book, and then we'll let people share their objects, because that's the most interesting part. All right, and then if we could click on layered legibilities. So this is for the introduction, and if you scroll down, this is the major zoom in of the quilt we're talking about. And then if you want to go to the website, if you just Google American Contact Princeton, it'll come up. You can look at more details of the quilt. All right, so my grandma Honey read quilts the way that I read books. Her arthritic fingers, swollen at the knuckles, could trace straight, zigzagging, or curved stitches, reading the raised colored thread selected by quilters with the pad of her finger and her eyes. I learned what I would call quilt collation from watching her. After stepping back and admiring a quilt's beauty at a county fair, in a hotel lobby, or an exhibit, she started in with the stitches, examining their length, their hue, interpreting the softness or the coarseness of its thread, and following the directions to reverse engineer how it was constructed. Honey felt ashamed of the backcountry way she spoke English. She used them there long before Billie Holiday made that sing. But folks were in awe of her charismatic storytelling. Dolly Parton described herself as a song teller, and I think of Honey as someone that I would call a quilt teller. She interpreted secondary threads throughout American history and pulled together new narratives for quilt readers. She mentioned in asides as she hovered over quilt tops, studying the colorful geometric piecing sewn into the larger patchwork, exactly how many different women's hands had contributed to a quilt, revealing a complex intellectual and cultural history of embodied knowledge that was lurking between the seams. And this kind of women's work and intellectual work was very durable. Quilts last. They last in the archives. They last in homes when paper sources and more ephemeral traces disintegrate. Quilt's material make can be read alongside other forms of quilts: inscriptions, diaries, newspapers, advertisements, letters, women's journals, and other household goods that show sort of the mass commodity world that these quilts are circulating in. But they also tell an alternative historical record of women's intellectual and political life in America. So quilt literacy, a practice that I understand stretches back to colonial America, became increasingly widespread in the industrialized antebellum America era. It was almost always a gendered practice. Sometimes you will find enslaved men or Mexican American men who participate in this, but usually it's women. And it's usually taught intergenerationally or socially among women. Quilting was and is a vivid written language used for record keeping. So families would commemorate weddings, births, all kinds of different things with the stitching, political engagement, commemoration, and decorating. Women were encouraged to perfect it domestically, but they also publish it by hanging it on walls in public, in fairs where it's peer-reviewed, it's judged, and there is an entire catalog of special, or a canon of patterns that are to be mastered or used that represent different things symbolically. And it was especially a way that women, especially poor women and uneducated women, could enact intellectual arguments publicly. And that was certainly true in my family up through the 1980s. I would say my grandma was someone who would probably be called illiterate by my colleagues, but I actually think she did astonishing genealogical work when I really sort of step back and look at what it was that she was doing and tracing with historical documents. So like cataloging books bibliographically, there are variants in the pattern that tell a nuanced story of a quilt's production and use over time. Quilters reback and rebound quilts due to wear and tear. There are revisions from seam rippers that remove damaged pieces that are disbound or swapped out for a more fitting swatch. Here, this alteration is a form of self-critique. Giveaways typically include when a thread's color or a width changes or a non-period piece fabric is detected, indicating that there had been revision. And so over time, from watching her, I started to learn other forms of materiality that I could read a quilt's history just from looking at it. So storage and care left more clues about how to read them. Lumpy quilts, unfortunately, went through a washing machine. Small holes normally meant moths. Wear lines normally meant ringers. Yellowing normally meant sweat. Rusting, bugs. Boxing, mold, or more bugs. Browning was dye or ink that transfers and is accelerated by the chemical make of the other fabric's dyes. And this is something that we see in rare books. It's normally called ghosts or ghosting. Creases were from folding. Wrinkles typically happen when a novice starts at the outside and tries to sew in instead of starting at the pattern and working their way out. Heft revealed something of climate or utility. Size gave hints of the intention. Was this meant for a baby? Was this meant for a couple? Was this meant to be hung and never to be used in a practical way? Smells tell all kinds of stories, like too much information, but it could be useful. Things like this quilt has been through a flood. This quilt was carried across the country. And so Honey's quilt comprehension was encouraged and sharpened after decades of quilting with women on military bases, in churches, in prayer groups, grassroots political organizing, but also in formal competitions. And so in this way, there's this canon that she starts learning about the American quilt patterns and formal sewing, but also social sewing. So when Honey passed away and could no longer translate quilts for me as historical documents, something that I thought was quite magical, I decided to try and learn it myself. And then more importantly, I wanted to train students about how to read quilts and how to read quilts bibliographically. I wanted them to think about quilts critically as textiles that are texts in the archives to uncover more quilt tellers. Because the truth is, there are so many groups, especially enslaved women, who left a prodigious amount of quilts. There was recently a collection that was turned over that's like 9,000 quilts that recently went to the Bancroft. So there's an enormous amount of history that are sewn into them that we've largely just ignored. In her 2010 American Historical Address, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich said to the AHA that sometimes the best way to approach a big topic is to focus on a little one, including using a quilt. And so when I say that I try to get students to think about it critically and bibliographically, I mean not just looking at the symbolism, which is typically how quilts have been used in art history or by historians. I mean, sometimes that's really powerful. Like if you think about the Harriet Powers, which is a pretty famous enslaved quilt, there are very clear biblical symbolism that can be analyzed, but I want us to sort of get deeper into what's going on. And so this was sort of my first inkling of like when Honey died, I thought, okay, there is an enormous amount of embodied knowledge and ways of reading that everyday people have throughout the Americas that the Academy ignores. But also when we think about sort of the classic history of the book, I would look at these books in the historiography. It was very much focused on sort of colonial America. When you look at the Americas, I study and teach in the American West. And so these books were typically in English, usually by like white, colonial men. Sometimes we would get pamphlets, but it just didn't represent the world that I knew, and it didn't represent the world that I inhabited or the history that I came from, nor my students. And so that was sort of the original interest of mine was, okay, in the American West and Indigenous studies, all these other sort of fields that I touch on and work with people, we're using materiality all of the time, but how do we get a bunch of people to train others about how they're reading objects? And so I thought, well, we need a bunch of people and bring them together and we can do that. And so that was sort of the original impetus for the project was, how do we preserve these forms of reading that are possibly disappearing, but also can be uncovered and recover it? So I'm going to talk briefly about this quilt, do a few little key takeaways from the book, and then I'm going to let you guys dig into your objects. So I became fascinated with this quilt in Hawaii. Hawaii is tropical. You wouldn't normally think of Hawaii as the place to go for really thick, crazy quilts, but in fact, it is. So I started studying it in Honolulu, and this is the story of how it came to be. So imprisoned in a small upstairs room in her palace in Honolulu, Liliuokalani, who was Hawaii's last queen, kept her hands and her mind busy by making this very large, crazy quilt. She cut up her extensive royal gowns that had been imported and purchased during her travels to Paris, London, and San Francisco. So this was a very global person. And she turned satin military sashes and patriotic ribbons that would go on headbands, colorful hat bands, corsets, and also flags into her binding strips that hold maybe this one, if you go down there, it holds them together, binds the squares together. On it, she embroiders Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani, imprisoned at Iolani Palace, January 17th, 1895. We begin this quilt here, and it is a copper plate script with silk thread. And she did this while being held captive for 8 months by the Euro-American, largely American corporate provisional government that had just usurped her power. The Queen was very much a prominent international figure. As I mentioned, she traveled throughout the United States extensively trying to promote Hawaii. She crossed the Atlantic. She was friends with Queen Victoria. She attended her global jubilee in 1887 and was received in Buckingham Palace. So this was someone that internationally and diplomatically was recognized as somebody in power. But what's interesting when you look at the quilt and start breaking it down, there's a ton of interesting clues about her political power and the way that she thought about her reign and her sovereignty. So, and I also should say, quilts come to Hawaii around 1825, 1830. They're brought by missionaries, both Methodist, later Mormon, but primarily American missionaries who bring it as sort of this domesticating tool to teach Hawaiian women. And the Queen adapted it for her own purposes, and she very subversively stitched a timeline of historical events from the perspective of Native Hawaiians, using this imported imperial craft to translate her own political ideas in a way she felt people would listen. So embroidered on the quilt are the names of her cabinet members, the commemoration of her 3-day war in January of 1895 that gripped Oahu, and the phrase "forced down at the provisional government proclaimed," along with the royal seals, the embroidery of her military helmets, and the 2 Hawaiian royal flags of those who protected her. But also it suggests and shows the raising of the American flag. There's also, if you go into if you want to click on if you scroll down, there's some more images that we can click on to make, if we can click on these and make them larger. There's some interesting keys about some of their sort of what's going on here. So an owl sits in a mahina, a crescent moon representing Hawaii, who is the deity, and also the Euro-American sign of wisdom. A pastel pink and white snowflake, not a ton of snowflakes going on in Hawaii, on a satin blue background is reminiscent of the paper snowflake cutting that was taught by the missionaries to all Hawaiian children. In the 19th century, Hawaiian women then began to appropriate this snowflake cutting technique to create Hawaiian flowers in two-tone applique motifs on quilts, and you can still see them today. They're still made today. They're quite amazing. And so she was acknowledging how everyday Hawaiian women began to adopt and subvert these things on their own. There's also flowers and insects that replicate the Queen's ornate gardens. And in the introduction, you can read more about what the specific flowers mean. But I think one of the most interesting things is also this garden. So basically, while she was locked up in this tower, the US government was like, that's cute, you can quilt, and we're going to also let you play in your garden. But what they didn't realize what she was doing is when she would get the clippings from her garden or have it brought to her each night, like when you go to a market, it was wrapped in newspaper. And so while she was quilting or while she was flower arranging, she was actually looking at the political documents in the news to understand what was going on militarily, politically, domestically, and internationally. And this was how she starts exchanging information. And so she says, that they wrapped in the newspaper. I did everything I could to save these bits of news, which I sought opportunity at intervals to read. There were times when I saw something of such interest, I could not resist the temptation to mention it to the guards standing there. And so when you're really attentive to the materiality of the quilt, what it's made out of, the fact that she's cutting up her gown, she's cutting up these political documents, and that she's then embroidering information from this Hawaiian constitution, the Hawaiian lineage that she came out of, it speaks very clearly about her ideas of where her place was in the world. And I wanted to start out the book with somebody who was engaging in intercultural contact with something that was seen as a traditional American form, but had absolutely no interest in being affiliated with America. And so that was sort of why, of all our objects, we had a ton of objects, we start there. And so just to give you a little bit of information about the book. So as we mentioned, there's 48 chapters, and the items that the authors chose, and we allowed them to choose their objects, range in size from 4 miles long to 7 by 10 centimeters. And they date from millennia in the past to the 2000s. The most recent one is an American Girl doll and her book. So as a historian, this was a wild task because we're expanding the periodization of America in a very radical way. But it also upsets this traditional idea of when books arrive in the New World. And we're saying, no, very different story here. It starts in a very different way. So objects communicate. Some are books and they can be found in library reading rooms. Others exist beyond alphabetic communication and beyond the pages, which is what we're going to be talking about today, found in all kinds of public spaces. And so what we asked all the authors to do was to create an object biography. And so look at how this object was created, where did it come from, how did it circulate, who read it, how do we read it, what is its long history after its initial creation. And so that's something that we also do with this quilt. I should also say we're using a very generous definition of book in book history. So historian Joan Shelby Rubin said in the JAH, book historians are quick now to note that for them, the book is really shorthand for a full range of written communication. Pamphlets, newspapers, printed ephemera, handwritten posters, letters, diaries, printed forms, these and other genres or formats that can and are studied under the umbrella of book history. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that we started using the term environmental textuality, because one thing that became very clear with our Indigenous studies scholars was that there are a lot of ways in which Indigenous tribes would literally reshape the earth that in a way that has syntax. And so thinking about, in the most basic sense, when you read colonizer documents, the ability to read the sea, to read the stars, to read a scene, to read a room. What does that mean when you put it materially into a way that actually can make sense? And what can we get from that to tell those histories in new ways? In terms of terminology, material text is often used to acknowledge both the legible and the physicality of an item, and textual objects emphasize a range of physical forms an item can take. All right, and then just a few takeaways. So obviously, we're trying to redefine the concept of book and reading. Glenda and I use the term layered legibilities to talk about how in these intercultural encounters, the way these objects are read and these texts are read are often countering each other. There are a lot of misreadings. And so making sure that all of those layers of how objects are read are preserved was important to us. Third, we were also trying to focus on the importance of this orality and orality that emphasizes the ways in which material texts have this relationship to sound, which should be obvious, but as we discussed this morning, is often dropped out of traditional book history. The other sort of major thing was just pushing back on this Eurocentric understanding. So Marlena's essay that she's going to talk about is one of my favorites because it really materially shows that things like ink, silver, paper are coming out of the Americas that are materially required to make the European books and the manuscripts as we know them. And so looking at that, how to really break that down. The circulation and afterlives of objects, and then also, as I mentioned, this massive interdisciplinary approach. Two quick things, language. All of the essays are published in English right now, but there are enormous amount of languages that are represented in the objects. I'm trying to work with the group to get some of these translated. So some of the universities that are interested are in Brazil, Ghana, and France. And so we're hoping by working with that group, we can really expand the ability to read these objects. And then I think the last thing that's really important is just a call for further exploration. So now that we've set up this project, really just encouraging people to figure out how to adopt it in classrooms, but also objects are everywhere. So as I discussed with Honey's quilt, I mean, I can look at some jean quilt that's been in my room for a decade and learn so much about her life. And so having students think critically about what is legible in the world, they don't have to have access to the Harry Ransom Center to do that. They can do that anywhere. And so really pushing the boundaries of how these academic practices and our disciplines can become useful to different communities on the ground is something, and knowledge sharing that obviously communities have an enormous amount of knowledge for us to learn as well. So I'm going to stop there and say, I just want to thank everyone who's been on this journey and has been so dedicated to this project. It's been incredibly humbling. And while I was alone in various places during COVID, to be able to read about these astonishing objects and other moments that were so much more grave, just really humbled and put things in perspective for me, like moments that were truly apocalyptic for the people that were going through something, really changed my historical understanding of my own moment. So I just want to thank everyone for the astonishing dedication that they showed. All right, thank you.
So we're gonna go with Marlena.
All right. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I have two screens going, so in case it looks like I'm looking in two directions, it's probably because I am. All right, let me share my PowerPoint quick. I have some visual aids just so you guys can kind of see what I was working with here. Let me make this a bit bigger. All right, here we go. Okay, so before jumping in, I'd like to thank Drs. Rhae Barnes and Glenda Goodman for putting all of this together, and UT Austin and the Institute for Historical Studies for hosting. I also want to take a second to acknowledge all the folks who made this research possible, including Dr. Ana Lu Lopez at the Newberry Library, for her guidance with Nahuatl, the University of Oregon's Nahuatl Dictionary, and everyone at the Preservation Research and Testing Division at the Library of Congress, who made the book history parts of this a success. They opened my eyes to how books can be studied as physical objects very scientifically instead of just looking at them as sort of a textual entity. I'm going to jump in with some information about my object first, and to give a little context for it. After that, I'll talk about where my research took me and some basic conclusions. I can't talk about everything that I wrote about. It's quite dense, but I'm going to try to give some highlights that I felt would be useful for folks interested in the material analysis of the book, and sort of as another way that books can be read and looked at. So, here we go. I studied Alonso de Molina's Arte de la Lengua Mexicana y Castellana, which was printed in 1571, exactly 50 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Molina was a Franciscan priest who arrived in Mexico in 1522 as a child and grew up speaking Nahuatl and Spanish before joining the priesthood. His grammar book is for Nahuatl. It was a mere 14 centimeters in length, less than the length of the average person's hand. And this picture shows his vocabulary sitting underneath it. So you can see the grammar book's pretty small. The vocabulary book is a lot heftier. It's also been rebound, which can create some problems, but maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. There are many reasons for a grammar book to be this small, and many grammar books for Indigenous languages in the Americas were this small. Here are some examples with my hand in the picture for comparison. On the left is a grammar book for Tupi from Brazil, and on the right is a grammar book for Quechua. I promise my hand is not actually touching the ink on that page. It's like right above it, but just so you can get an idea, these books are very small. Spain controlled paper mills and printing in the Americas in a very intense way, which made paper a bit of a commodity. And so a small, simplified grammar book was far more portable, was more accessible, and was just plain cheaper than a massive tome like the vocabulary. Like that vocabulary is going to stay in your bookshelf. It's not going to be traveling around everywhere. Since his grammar was small, Molina was limited in the basic grammatical information and in the vocabulary that he could include for his translated examples, a few of which I'll show in a second. These were not his only limitations. Molina was writing in classical Nahuatl, but was trying to use European grammatical terms that he knew from European grammar books, specifically Nebrija's grammar book, right? That was like the huge one. These two difficulties are important to consider because his book was the first printed grammar for facilitating Nahuatl-Spanish communication and was a reference for beginner Nahuatl learners in the 1500s, primarily other preachers, perhaps some government officials, maybe some merchants, anyone who would want to have access to this language. In short, it was for a European audience. Like many grammars, Molina's book was biased, or perhaps I should say linguistically skewed, in part because of these limitations of size and because of his own interests as a priest. With that in mind, his grammar could impact the terms of Spanish Nahuatl communication through the types of vocabulary that the book provided to early learners. Nahuatl speakers who learned from this book would find clear limits for what they could talk about, with most incorporated vocabulary revolving around sin, conversion, and religion in general, anthropological considerations for understanding family units, and interestingly, items popular in the tribute system. So you could talk about silver and gold, but you couldn't super ask how somebody's day was going. So kind of an interesting mix there. Let me show you guys a page. So this is just a page from the book, and I've kind of done some underlining. You guys can see the top red underlining here is different ways to say that people are good. So we have, y'all are good, vosotros sois buenos, aquellos son buenos, los señores son buenos, yo era bueno, yo seré bueno. So like, I was good, I will be good. There's this very like moralizing level to the vocabulary being introduced here for the Nahuatl examples in the Spanish translations. Down below, we have an emphasis on possessive pronouns, and this could be family relationships. It can also be the priest, right? So we have mi padre, my father, your father, and our father. So this language is very particular. All right, I don't want to super get into the textual analysis here, just in the interest of time and because I want to talk about my methodology for analyzing the book sort of as an object. But you can see that this other section on possessive adjectives and his examples feature language that is also like a lot heavier and more difficult to categorize, but also more problematic. So in addition to talking about like my father, your father, we see how to use possessive pronouns sort of when they're attached to another noun. And these are the nouns he picked. So we have cosa sucia, mi suciedad, cosa negra, mi negrura, which could be sort of spiritual darkness, right? My darkness, but it can also be connected to skin color. On later pages, we also see him connect whiteness to goodness and Christianity and to conversion. So, this is the kind of language he was teaching. All right, and so at the same time that grammar books like Molina's facilitated early communication in the Americas, they did so in a way that also colonized through language study and pedagogy. The extant copy that I studied specifically came from the Library of Congress. So all of these pictures are from the Library of Congress copy. So about my methodology, combining the history of Molina's book with a textual analysis and an analysis of the paper and the writing styles and the inks left in the book, we can begin to learn more about past Nahuatl learners that actually engaged specifically with the Library of Congress's copy. Basically, I can confirm that this book was actually used by people and that it could have impacted their learning of Nahuatl. Confirming this is useful because the provenance records that the Library of Congress has are not great, as in they don't exist. Yes, this book was sort of part of older acquisition practices, and you can't get that information. Just because a book was printed doesn't mean anyone in the period used it. So having a lot of evidence of reader use is great for talking about how readers actually used it. All right, so overall, my analysis was possible because this grammar book was well used and stained with inky fingerprints in the bottom corners of some of the pages and 10 whole added pages of notes at the end. For this part of my analysis, I'm going to focus on these 10 pages, which is also where a lot of the reader engagement is, even though you see it scattered throughout. These 10 pages are covered with handwritten notes on Nahuatl verb conjugation. The notes are copied directly from Molina's actual text. So this is someone referencing, jumping back and forth. And they include an attempt at translating a prayer into Nahuatl, as well as some biblical verses, which support the idea that Molina's book was referenced for learning and translating, perhaps by someone religiously inclined or affiliated with the church. It's books like this, the grimy, marked up books full of doodles of men in hats, marginalia, fingerprints and spills, rather than the pristine mint copies that can tell us the most about actual reader use. But there are elements that my eye can fail to see and that my camera can fail to capture. Ink types, paper types, watermarks are all easy things to lose in the pictures I've shown or when you happen to digitize something. So let's get into my material analysis of the last 10 pages of the book, because I want to highlight that there is a lot to learn about a book beyond its text, and we can use scientific methods like spectroscopy to get there. Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, which is what the Library of Congress helped me out with, confirms that the added pages with the learner's notes, as well as the pages of the actual book, are both cotton rag, which was used in the 1500s. Cotton rag was replaced with wood pulp in the 1800s. So these added pages at the end were made, sometime before the 1850s-ish. So not only do the added pages copy from Molina directly, they are of the same paper type, and the book and the added pages could possibly have been connected early in the book's life. But how, date-wise, can we more clearly connect the learner notes to Molina's book and its time period? Because the pages paper quality can't super tell us a lot. The answer is paleography. Pairing the paper results with a paleographic analysis helps us narrow down even further what time period the added pages are from. Most of the notes are written by a single hand, and based on the styles of the Ys and a few other variables regarding capitalization and the use of ligatures, which create abbreviated words, we can conclude that the main learner and writer of these pages was most likely studying Nahuatl in the late 1500s or early 1600s, focusing on creating conjugation tables and translating prayers. There's also some evidence for a writer with what I'll call an unconfident hand, perhaps a child. So first, so you guys can see the tabular array. This is like a very common format for grammar books. This is from the last 10 pages of the book. So you can see this person copying. You can see some of the shapes of the letters here that are like very typical from the period. You can see the Y in particular. And then here we have, and I do not know why this picture ended up being blurry, I'm sorry. You can see a Gothic script right below it. You can see a very unconfident hand. This perhaps belonged to a child. I mean, you can never say for sure, but this is somebody who didn't write a lot trying to copy what was above it, which is Joseph or Josephus, right? We can also see this lovely example of the Gothic script, which again, likely somebody connected to the church if they're using that. All right, but there's more. Using another type of spectroscopy, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, we can see that the added pages also have two types of red ink. One type was made with vermilion and the other with cochineal. Cochineal is a red ink from the Americas and was not known to Europeans until after 1492. In reverse, while natural vermilion was known to Mesoamericans, the mineral was rare and was used for particular types of art. Using vermilion as a manuscript pigment was a European practice, as it was the red ink used in Spain, and its increased use in the Americas for alphabetic writing and paper marking did not start until after the 1560s, or possibly even the 70s. Additionally, this analysis confirms the use of a black ink called iron gall ink, which is very typical for the period. The use of this ink was also introduced in the Americas in the 16th century. You don't need a test to identify that. You can usually just use your eye, and if the paper looks like it's being eaten by the ink, then it's iron gall ink. All right, so sort of to conclude a little bit, and here's the examples of the cochineal use. You guys can see the red ink there. Both of those are cochineal. This data combined together shows that the individual, perhaps individuals who wrote on the inserted pages in the late 1500s or early 1600s inhabited an intercultural space that had access to European inks, vermilion and iron gall ink, and European writing implements, as well as New World cochineal. This individual or individuals didn't only practice conjugation, they translated biblical passages and prayers into Nahuatl, and it's very likely that they were affiliated with the church based on the script types that we see. So to wrap up, by uncovering information about ink and pigments, script types, and evidence of reader use, it's possible to understand this book not just in terms of how Marlena intended for his text to be used, but also in terms of how readers actually used it and engaged with it. Techniques connected to book history can help us further develop knowledge about the readers and students of the past by revealing information about their cultural surroundings, their beliefs, and the access that they had to the different raw materials of bookmaking. All right, that's what I got. Thank you.
Just really quick, can you explain where the ink comes from?
The cochineal?
Yes, for people who know. Yeah, the cochineal.
So it's from an insect that's harvested from prickly pear cactuses. So, and it was this desirable red ink that Spain actually did a lot to sort of control the production of at the beginning. But yeah, so this got onto the book and was being used as a red ink. It's very neat to see because like vermilion was the popular one at the time.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Professor Deal.
You think you could, is it possible to shrink? I'm just afraid my images might be. Okay, awesome. So I was going to use this as an opportunity to dig deeper into the Codex Mexicanus, which is the focus of my object biography in the book. And actually I should have said first, thank you to our editors, our organizers, and the audience for being here. The Codex Mexicanus was created at about 1580 and in New Spain, which had formerly been the capital of Tenochtitlan of the Aztec Empire. And going back to a point Lynn made about an apocalyptic feeling to a work like this, 1580 is quite significant because there was an epidemic that had really decimated the native population in 1576. And I feel like the creation of this manuscript was partially a response to that. I think the manuscript was created by a local community hoping to have to sort of have a place to store knowledge. And the forms of knowledge take lots of different genres are covered here. The book itself is quite small, 10 centimeters by 20 centimeters, owned today by the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, so not accessible in person. Fortunately, I asked them to make digital images for me, and then they put those all online. So it is very accessible now through their system. And just to put it into context of the native manuscript tradition pre-conquest, I wanted to bring in one of the manuscripts from Tenochtitlan that's as close to the native style as I could find. All the other books were burned by the Spaniards that come from Tenochtitlan. Those that survive are more from regional centers. So this is a divinatory manuscript, and the books usually took a screenfold format. I think the Codex Mexicanus brings together the native bookmaking tradition with a Spanish one. And for the Spaniards, what I found the creators of the manuscript were looking at was most likely a Spanish almanac, such as the Repertorios de los Tiempos. These are described as guides to living, and the Aztecs called books the same thing. They're like guides to life. So the book traditions come together quite nicely between Mexico and Spain. For the Codex Mexicanus, as I said, it brings together lots of different content. So it begins with a Spanish saints calendar that they have, I believe, taken from a repertorio. So as you can see on the left, and they've translated it into the native system of writing. So they're taking, like, this would be like the Day of Mary, and they're writing Ave Maria in Nahuatl hieroglyphic writing. So that's the Christian calendar. Meanwhile, on the bottom, they've added dates from the Aztec calendar. So the book is also showing what I would argue is like a new conception of time being inscribed within the work. So it's like Christian time is on a foundation of Aztec time. The manuscript also continues with, again, that idea of the two systems of time coming together. So in the middle, you have a Dominical wheel, which is like a perpetual calendar. And then next to it is the Aztec calendar. The 4 Aztec year signs are rabbit, reed, flint, and house. And those are on the circle. So they're showing the coming together of these two ideas of time. There also are inscription or transcriptions on the manuscript that I think sets it at 1580. So it's mentioning the establishment of a college in San Pablo, which was probably founded by Alonso de la Vera Cruz. And I suspect the creators of this manuscript were going to that library and seeing the Christian works. And here's just another example to show you how they're looking at a Spanish book, or I should say this one's German actually, but looking at European books and translating them into a native system of writing. Then that is followed by what looks like, as you can see on the right, zodiac imagery, which is obviously again coming from European tradition. On the left is the medical chart. So speaking of difficult methodology, I had no idea about European medicine when I started this, and now I could tell you if you're feeling ill, I could run your numbers and tell you if it's a good, bad, or indifferent day for purging and bleeding. So that's what they're copying here, and I feel like that, along with this next page, is a zodiac man. And again, this is based on European medical beliefs at this time that illnesses were caused by the zodiac. So going back to the creation of this right after this epidemic, I feel like they were looking towards European medical practices as something that they need to understand so that they can cure themselves of these illnesses that are Spanish in nature. And going back to Marlena's points too about how you can see the wear of the pages, these 3 pages are some of the are in some of the worst condition, and I suspect that's because it's showing people were constantly going back to these pages because of illnesses. Then what do we get? Then we go towards more Aztec contents. So this is a 2-page genealogy that gives the Aztec past, starting from their migration, continuing through, and again, it's in really poor condition at the very far right. But the first, the Aztec rulers, probably stuff's like 1550. So it follows, actually like Doña Isabel Montezina's daughter is there right at the very end. She was one of the most wealthy people at that time. And then it gets into, again, a much more traditional Aztec history, which most of these follow a very standardized pattern. So here we get in the year 1 Flint, the Aztecs left their homeland of Aztlan and they sort of step onto the timeline. So they're starting their history and there's this migration. And it's very long history, so I will not give it all to you. Just to say, though, the history continues through the Spanish arrival. There's no stop. They just start incorporating Spanish ways of life. So here we see the arrival of Cortez in the year 1 read, and we see like the conquest and the establishment of colonial rule. One of the things, going back to the relationship with the repertorios, is that I feel as if the Mexicanos is sort of anticipating a new repertorio tradition for Mexico City. So in 1606, a repertorio was published in Mexico City. And what's interesting to me is they add the history of Mexico, of the Aztec Empire. So whereas the ones out of Spain focus much more on Spanish history, now we're getting this idea that New Spain has its own history. And whereas the Spanish history was built on the Roman past, here the history is being built upon the Aztec past. And all of that I think is very interesting coming out of the pictorial tradition of the Aztecs. To give you another sense too, something interesting I think about this work is it's very much a living document. So it was clearly updated over time. And the imagery on the top had always confused me because this is from the imagery on the bottom is the Aztec history in the 14th century. And then it led me to question, why do they have Christian iconography on the top register? And what I realized was that they were writing, I'm sorry, it's so hard to read. They were taking a catechism, the Articles of Faith, and translating it into the Aztec system of writing. And they just added that to this empty part of the manuscript. So they found room. And I think that speaks back to the idea that the book itself is a repository of knowledge, something that the people have for themselves. And let's say the Spaniards go away, they have this book for themselves that they can continue to worship. Something that along those lines that's interesting that comes out of the book is the idea that the creators of it, I think, are very much doing so as Christians. So the Saints calendar, the catechism, and then this page that follows the history is establishing themselves as exemplary Christians. And I think this one is showing their Christian knowledge. So what you see on the right is a Nahua man, and he's having a vision of the temptation of Christ. And I know it's really hard to see, but I'm not sure my pointer's working. Here's Christ, and we were talking about the Tenochtitlan place sign with the sign for stones. They're very much in the Aztec script, whereas everything else is incorporating Christian style or European style. And so I think they're saying New Spain was a place worthy of a sighting of Christ, that Christ revealed himself in New Spain, as we see here. Then the manuscript ends with a part of the manuscript that harkens most to native religious traditions. But as you notice, the pages are completely whitewashed. So there's some evidence of paintings underneath, but my sense is this last section was probably some of the most controversial in terms of New Spain. So at about the time this was being made as well, there was lots of debate on whether or not the natives were becoming true Christians. And like, for example, the Florentine Codex by Sahagún was censored at this time. So my sense is the contents here were probably too dangerous to have in a book like this. So they had to sort of negate these contents at the end. So that one is where everything kind of breaks down. So I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex?
Oh, did I stop sharing?
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Cristina and Santiago and Lynn for bringing us together today. So I want to talk today about this book. It was published or written by Juan Bautista de Liceo, a prolific writer born in the Americas, who lived during the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. His book, the title is translated as Admonitions for Confessors of Natives. It's a trilingual handbook that advises missionaries in the New World on how to speak with parishioners about marital affairs, rape, drinking, and dispensations. The admonitions appeared in two separate volumes printed between 1600 and 1601 in the convent of Santiago Tlatelolco. There we go. An influential but short-lived school founded by Franciscans in Mexico City in 1536 to train the children of the native elite. The book embraced research produced by missionaries within and beyond the walls of Santa Cruz to contextualize for novices indigenous beliefs, made suggestions to clerics on how to respond to quotidian matters, including abstinence and administering confession, and call attention to the need for additional personnel to carry the burden of evangelization. And while the content of the book is fascinating, I found I wanted to learn much more about the social networks involved in preparing Bautista's work for publication. You see, the book came to life at the center of the early modern period's most sophisticated ethnographic enterprise, Spanish colonization and evangelization of the Valley of Mexico after the fall of the Aztec Empire. Santiago Tlatelolco, situated in the northern part of Mexico City, served as the epicenter of early intellectual activity in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the political jurisdiction controlled by the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, North and Central America, and the Pacific. Prior to the war, Tlatelolco was an important altepec, or city-state in the Nahua or Aztec world, notorious for hosting a weakened and tattered population and an 8-day standoff as they made their final attempt to stave off Spanish-led forces during the summer of 1521. Spaniards established a convent in Tlatelolco after the war that served as the location of the Imperial College of Santa Cruz. University-trained missionaries and later distinguished alumni taught a curriculum centered on grammar, logic, and rhetoric known as the trivium, as well as the quadrivium, which included a combination of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The university stood at the center of an early missionary effort built on a particular mix of religious intolerance, austerity, and exploitation, combined with the sensibilities of humanistic inquiry and ethnographic fieldwork. The center nourished important studies of Nahua language and culture. Two of the college's pupils, Martín de la Cruz and Juan Badiano, wrote and illustrated the Libolis de Medicinalibus, a botanical treatise that documented the medical properties of plants from Mesoamerica. Around the same time, Bernardino de Sahagún collaborated with a team of indigenous intellectuals on the general history of the things of New Spain, commonly known as the Florentine Codex, a massive 12-volume bilingual Spanish-Nahuatl study of the Nahuatl culture and society. Each of these works reflects the dedication of indigenous intellectuals who researched, wrote, and translated manuscripts, but also the sophisticated craftsmanship of artist scribes who illustrated plants, deities, rituals, and animals that accompanied each study. Alonso de Molina's Vocabulario, the larger portion of the study that Marlena just presented, bilingual Spanish-Nahuatl dictionary, and one of the most influential studies of an indigenous language written in the 16th century, leaned heavily on the knowledge of Nahuatl grammarians. Don Antonio Valeriano, a distinguished alumnus of great rhetorical skill, and Hernando de Rivas, a cacique or native leader from Texcoco, and another of the college's former students, edited both Molina and Bautista's translations. Research generated at Santa Cruz shaped missionary activities in profound ways, but it did not always align with royal policy. authorities carefully guarded the output of research produced under evangelical patronage in the Americas. Starting in the 1570s, officials banned several important works, including the Florentine Codex, the Jesuit Juan de Tobar's History of the Arrival of the Indians, published in 1585, the Dominican Diego Duran's History of the Indies of New Spain, completed in 1581, and manuscripts by Toribio de Benavente, later compiled into two important books. Reasons for suppressing ethnographic research varied. In some instances, authorities feared that discussion of Mesoamerican rituals and deities could inspire admiration and sow confusion among recently converted native peoples. In other cases, royal officials suppressed ethnographic research to keep it out of the hands of European competitors in the global market. Histories that created a paper trail of Spanish misdeeds abroad, or ones that inspired dissent or generated polemic, also came under strict royal control. Bautista's Admonitions for Confessors represents the first important study published in Tlatelolco after authorities suppressed important ethnographic treatises at the end of the 16th century. Publication of the book coincided with Bautista's tenure as abbot of Santa Cruz, when he managed the transition between the old millenarian guard and the order's more pragmatic wing that continued the work of its predecessors, minus the apocalyptic ideas that animated the minds of early missionaries. Bautista took an active role in shaping ethnographic scholarship through various means. The Franciscan relied heavily on the support of alumni who played an active role in the college's intellectual life, including teaching, research, and publishing. The prologue to the Sermonario en Lengua Mexicana, another of Bautista's works, a collection of sermons in Nahuatl, in fact, that Bautista published in 1606, included detailed descriptions that characterized the arduous labor indigenous intellectuals supplied. Demand for skilled translators well-versed in Christian doctrine with fluency in Nahuatl, Latin, and Spanish ensured former students maintained close ties to their alma mater. Besides Valeriano and Rivas mentioned earlier, Bautista highlighted the work of other translators, including Pedro de Gante, a distinguished Tlatelolca professor with whom the author maintained a close relationship. Gante translated many things for me, the Franciscan observed, especially the lives of saints. For a space of 8 continuous years in residence in the convent of Tlatelolco, and 6 of those at the College of Santa Cruz, I always spoke with and consulted with him. Accomplished scribes who combined linguistic skill with elegant handwriting supplied the demanding labor of translating and transcribing hundreds of handwritten folios for missionary ethnographers. Agustin de la Fuente, another Tlatelolco native and an in-demand scribe, had collaborated closely with Bautista, Sahagún, and others writing and copying drafts of manuscripts produced in the college. He is one of the best and most dexterous scribes to have lived in this nation of Indians, the friar remarked with considerable admiration. He has been with me for 10 years, and everything I have published up to this point has passed and has been written by his hand. Presumably, de la Fuente prepared the draft of the Advertencias para los Confesores, or the Admonitions for Natives, when it went to press. So, since I'm short on time, I want to just summarize a few points of what I was trying to do with this piece. The experience of Tlatelolco and its college teaches us that innovative research about language and culture of groups targeted for evangelization drove early Franciscan activity. Along with indigenous collaborators, these individuals generated new methodology designed to investigate and understand the complex Nahuatl worldviews they encountered. Studies produced by those associated with the college coexisted in print and manuscript. Indigenous knowledge and labor played a key role in the making of books. Scribes, painters, grammarians, and printers were actively involved in shaping knowledge about Mesoamerican culture. Funding and support were key for the completion of the types of works produced in Tlatelolco. Without them, projects often stalled. Royal policies of secrecy and censorship limited the exposure of works produced, but did not successfully eliminate them. Thank you very much.
Yes. Do you want us to read your email?
Yeah, please.
I think it's a number 6.
Number 6, yes.
That one.
Yeah. Hi everyone, thanks for sticking with us today. And thanks Cristina and Raylene for the organization, and Raylene and Glenda for editing this wonderful volume. So let me just start with a brief context on the book and what the book means for me. It was one of the questions we wanted to start with. And I'd say there are two important things of this book from my perspective. Well, perhaps there are many others but for me, two main things. One is expanding our ideas of literacy and our ideas about the book with all the implications that has. We have fixation on the place that literacy and book, one specific form of literacy and one form of communicating through books, plays in the transmission of knowledge. And we've privileged that as a means to do intellectual history that has made us understand intellectual history, but from a very limited perspective. So I see one of the contributions of this book just expanding by what we mean with by literacy, in order to find new methodologies to address intellectual history that are perhaps less Eurocentric. One thing. The other thing I think means for me is centering the Americas without in an expansive way, trying to create a range of the different forms of intellectual production and different forms of literacy across borders and cultural tradition. So I find those two points just central in rethinking the way we've understood both, again, intellectual and book history. And the context, I'm gonna talk about this in a minute, but just let me say that I started perhaps this quest on expanding the history of the book around 2015. That's when I got there, and it's when I got to the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, where Alex and Raylene are also members. I got introduced into a new society of people who were trying to bring new perspectives to the history of the book. They were trying to envision bibliography as the material study of texts in a broader way. Yet often the classes and the spaces we were in reproduced many traditional methods of bibliography from which you felt excluded. And I always found, I never found myself comfortable calling myself a historian of the book, because I don't really study books. I study other forms of literacies and other forms of intellectual exchange and intellectual production that perhaps don't fit into that traditional label. So I study things like this. This is an indigenous textile from the Northern Andes, undated. It's in the collections of the British Museum. Brown ink, blue ink, some a series of panels with geometric shapes, what appear to be human shapes with round, like probably feathered head dressings, appear squatting in some of the panels. And then we have elements here that could be used for marking individuality of the people depicted. We have elements that can perhaps have elements of quantification, perhaps some visual depiction of the landscape. And these are the types of textiles that were very important in the Northern Andes. The Muisca people call these types of textiles boy, and we have very few of them in the humid conditions of the tropics. Cotton textiles just they disappear very easily. And so this one in the British Museum, it was probably taken out of a cave when in the 19th century when it just pre-Hispanic objects were becoming more expensive in European markets, and it was taken to Great Britain where it was donated to the British Museum. Of course, in the British Museum, this is just one of the items that is just not worth it enough to be displayed in their permanent collections. It's back in the deposit. So when I had to go actually look at it, I had to contact curators and go to the deposits of the British Museum. And of course, they let me in to look at it. But so this is an object that, if you look at it, it's all about pre-Hispanic indigenous material culture. It's embedded, I think it's framed in a larger Andean tradition of inscribing information in textiles, either in knots or in many other forms of manipulating textiles. And yet we don't have the criteria to read about them. We don't have enough of them to be able to decipher them and read them as texts, but we do have a lot of information on them through colonial Spanish sources. The colonial Spanish observers weren't interested in their ethnographic value, their value as objects of literacy, as containing literacy or knowledge. They were very interested in these objects as economic objects, right? So lots of accounting numbers. The Spanish in Muisca language, the subjects are called boy, and they're these very prestigious objects that carry the meaning of the person who holds them. So people are buried with their most important textiles. If you are seen with a textile that it's not probably doesn't have your own status, then you are transgressing and you are penalized. And in some dictionaries, we have entries that say the meaning of the paintings in textiles record history. So there are a few traces that give us the sense of the great social value of these textiles. But so that's the semantic meaning of boy. Once you the Spanish translated that as mantas, and the semantic associations of mantas in the archive are all as accounting categories. So when the Spanish arrived in the Andes and they installed the encomienda system, Muisca communities had to pay tribute to their encomenders. Muisca communities were distributed between different Spanish lords whom they had to pay tribute to, and the tribute was in this kind of objects. So you have a whole tribute system of a kingdom in this kind of textiles. If you look at accounting records of the New Kingdom of Granada, and in a year they could be paying 50, 60,000 of these textiles. One encomendero could receive 1,500 textiles easily every year. So no ethnographic descriptions, no actual objects, but a huge role in the economy. And what starts playing out, or the argument I want to make in this piece and in my larger work on the subjects, is that these objects were actually served as the very basic fabric of colonialism. They just encapsulated the expectations that Spanish people could have of their own wealth, how much tribute they received, but they also encapsulated the obligations indigenous peoples had towards the empire. So it becomes a really intercultural object that's mediating between the empire and the indigenous communities of the Andes. The Spanish settlers themselves didn't use these textiles. It was always I mean these textiles. Some of them were used. Most of them were used to as dresses. Some of them were hung in walls as decoration. Some of them were built into material culture to build containers. And if you start looking at it carefully, you start finding them in altars decorating churches. You start seeing them built into the material culture of Spanish household as in storage units. So you find them frequently, but you never find a Spanish dressed in a manta unless it's someone who's trying to go unrecorded to someone who's trying, perhaps in problem with the law, who's trying to disguise and pass as pretending to be as an indigenous person. Just
They call it pretendian.
a
Like pretending to
pretendian.
be an Indian.
Yeah.
Pretendian. Yeah.
Pretendian.
Yeah.
So it pretty much is everywhere, and yet it's nowhere. It encapsulates this interaction between indigenous peoples and the Spanish and the Spanish. The Spanish in some ways had to try to so it means that the mantas are going to synthesize their new obligations of indigenous peoples as members of the encomienda, but forces encomenderos to deal with a new economy. If you're an encomendero and are receiving 1,500 mantas a year, you won't wear them. You might have a few containers, but you need to find ways of converting those textiles in a form of wealth that's recognizable to you. And so you find that many encomenderos in 16th century New Granadas are dealers in mantas. They take the mantas and they go and find markets of indigenous peoples and sell them back to indigenous peoples. So they themselves, in a way, are incorporated into indigenous economies. They become traders in an economy that they themselves didn't make. So so it becomes, in a way, it shows this overlap of colonialism in which, yes, indigenous peoples are incorporated into an external system, but in which encomenderos are also being incorporated into that indigenous system of exchange. And it's, I guess, that overlap that I find that's very interesting from this type of textile. And so just to end, it's expanding literacy in a way, I would say. We don't have yet the code to read this, what the type of knowledge that was painted in these textiles. But if we read the movement of these textiles in society, when they were exchanged, when they passed hands, what they meant in the different circles, you're reading a different type of society that's coming into the making. Thank you.
So go down. This one, but I need to know when you put it. I'll make them decide. Okay, so I'm just gonna follow up with Santiago's reflection on the value of this book. And I think that for me, I mean, it has many wonderful things, but one thing that I appreciate the most is that it not only expands our understanding of literacy and what, how people read things, but I also think it makes an incredibly clear that we as individuals or communities, we can read things differently. And we are exposed to a repertoire of different objects that we read differently and we integrated them together. So I think it's just like, not because we're speaking about newspaper, these people are only reading newspapers. They're reading newspapers at the same time, they're reading images, the same time they're reading pamphlets, at the same time they're reading books, and they're putting all of that together. And that's pretty much what we're doing today. Like every time, I mean, I always said, like, I cannot restrict literacy and political knowledge to a book or newspaper, because we're also, when I'm not in Facebook, but I'm in Instagram or I'm in Twitter. And that's also a way to learn political knowledge, for example. So if we restrain our understanding just to books or newspapers, we're restraining also the way we in the present understand in this case, the political sphere. So I think that's one of the things that I value of this book. So I'll just try to quickly speak about my piece of paper, that's what it is, a piece of paper. And then we'll move to the Q&A, because that's what I want to hear from more you than me. So it was May 1789, when the King of Spain, Carlos IV, signed the royal decree to regulate the treatment that planters and masters should give to their enslaved population. It was not the first time that the Spanish laws regulate this, because in the Recopilación de Indias from 1681, there's some normative rule regulating the commerce, lives, and occupation and treatment of the slave population. But it was really the first time that they approved and they created a fully rule approved that was very comprehensively trying to control the way that enslaved people were treated. And this was issued in 1789. And this is known as the Código Negro de 1789. And the idea was to control the way enslavers and overseers treated enslaved people. And this decree included like the way they could be taught Catholic faith in plantations, the way they could celebrate Catholic holidays, how many days they could rest. It also regulates the obligations that planters had towards their enslaved workers in terms of food, shelter, clothing. So it was like the first time they're also regulating physical punishments, and it was stipulating the moderation in whipping, chaining, shackling. It was definitely limiting practices of mutilation, burning, or torture that could endanger the lives of the enslaved people. So 8 months after the publication of this Spanish Black Code, the judges of the Real Audiencia in Caracas, which is like the royal court, they met to discuss the impact of the decree in the province of Venezuela, which, as probably you know, mostly the enslaved population did not represent more than the 20% of Venezuelan population, but they were all located in the same area, which is the coastal area where they produce cacao. So these members of the elite and judges met to discuss the effects or impact of this decree, and they thought that it was they didn't need this decree in Venezuela, because in their opinion, Venezuelan masters and overseers treated their slaves very well, and they couldn't understand why they have to follow this regulation. They started saying that if they do the regulation, then the enslaved people would wrongly believe they have rights, or it could incite rebellion or disobedience. So they basically said, we're not going to apply this Black Code right now. So pretty much like cumplo pero no obedezco. And we're going to keep this away from the public eye. So speaking about, publication. And so they said, we're not going to apply this. It's going to, I quote, it's going to result in an economic disaster, political upheaval, and violence. And the slaves will try to become masters of the country. They literally use those words. This is pre-Haitian Revolution. So ultimately, they decide that they're going to hide the decree, and but they will eventually show it, but without any hurry, and making use of measures capable of slowly calming down the ardent spirits. So they have the feeling that some things were starting to heat up in Venezuela. Maybe this was not the best moment to publish this decree. So now you can show.
I love the reveal.
Yes, here. So we can put it, you can put it completely there. Perfect. So 6 months later, this is June 1790, it was evident that the common people of Caracas were well aware of the existence of this Black Code, and were plotting how to pressure local authorities to fulfill the crown's orders. So it was the morning of June 12th, where when 4 incendiary baskinades like this one were found affixed on the walls of the Central Square Plaza in Caracas, one of the most popular and busy public space in the city. The 4 papers all bore the same message written in a clumsy handwriting in blank ink. It says, "O sorrows, O cries, or death," I'm translating for you right now, "we announce to the public that we are summoned of the royal decree that has come from Her Majesty in favor of us, the slaves. This, the royal decree, will be published more by force than by the willingness of the white and royal audiencias, which has not indicated day and hour, to the disgrace of all the white men and women, blancos y blancas, of the city, May 18, 1790. So below the written text, there was an illustration made in pencil of a black man with a machete in his right hand and a white man's head dripping blood on his left hand. I don't know if you can see the poor white man. Yes. By the time the officials found these papers, people were in the public square already debating about the meaning in small circles. Horrified by the anonymous threat to the social order, local officials debated of the authorship of these broadsides or baskinades, wondering whether local Black people or, I quote, "idle and evil white people insisting in provoking a Black uprising might have written and drawn these baskinades and put it on the public space." Officials, I have to say, never identified the author or authors of these papers, not the person responsible for posting them in public. And afraid that the information would spread out and incite more curiosity, they basically collected and remained silent and secret. They never really want to talk about this. These packagings, I have to say, began to circulate a year before the first slave uprisings erupted in Saint-Domingue. So speaking about this idea that sometimes we have seen that Saint-Domingue was unthinkable, I don't think it was that unthinkable because people are literally talking about this possibility, right? There's an imagination of there's an imaginary of people thinking about violent rebellions, reflecting these pervasive tensions between master and slave people in Venezuela, but also tensions between white and free enslaved Blacks and mixed race battles. So it seems that the notion of a slave uprising or even a revolution was not that unthinkable. White masters they fear a slave rebellion that will exterminate the white elites, transforming the former slaves into masters of the country. And in the meantime, we have people talking about what could happen if they don't follow the orders from the crown. These publicly displayed papers were not merely reflections of these tensions between social and racial groups and the growing awareness of Atlantic abolitionism or amelioration of slavery. But for me, they also serve as an important instrument for communication. Baskinades containing written text and illustrations are displayed in public spaces. They seek to overcome these mnemonic limitations of oral culture and circumvent the restrictions of a literary world largely controlled by the white elites, and in this case, the state. So for me, these are very interesting ways in which people are communicating, not only because they're creating a message, a written message that's supposed to be read out loud, and that was literally what was happening. Whoever knew how to read, they would read that out loud to the people seeing it. But there's also an image that's telling a very, in this case, violent consequence of what's going on. I think it's very interesting that they included blancos y blancas. And I think Karen Grover, when she was here last year, she was talking about this idea of just including gender in this case is particularly clear. But for me, the other thing is just the recognition that whoever is creating these baskinades, and again, we don't know the authors, they're very aware of this kind of a semi-literacy of the population of Caracas, right? Like I agree with you that it's very restricting to talk about the people or the communities as either literate or non-literate. This is a huge group of people in the middle who know how to read maybe, but not to write, or they know how to hear written materials, or they know how to read images. So I like to talk about semi-literacy as something of a community that understands the role of literacy, but lives at the fringes of literacy. And again, if we continue restricting ourselves to just written messages or printed messages, we're forgetting about this population that lives on those sides. And that's why I always like to talk about readers and listeners, because there's always For me, reading is also a social practice of people reading out loud to others, and the others practice participating in the process of creating knowledge. I think this object also shows that. So that for me, I mean, this is the beauty of finding this. There were 4 of these. I only found 1 in Caracas and 1 in Archivo de India. So it's pretty clear that they took one, they sent it to Spain saying, this is what's happening here. This is crazy. Forget about royal decrees right now. This is not a moment for a royal decree. And they kept 1 in Caracas. This one is the one that they have the Archivo de Indias. It's not really big. It's like this size. So it's not that big. They put in the 4 kind of pillars of the square plaza, and they put it on a day of market, right? So there's a recognition that speaking about market and economic transactions, they recognize the role of the plaza in a Dia de Mercado, and that's when they decided to post it on the Mercado. So this is this is my object. I'm still thinking about it, and I have, for me, that's like the first emoji of the 18th century emoji. It's very violent, but that's the way I like to think about it, right? Like when people talk about emojis, I don't think emojis is like a 2000 thing. It just came earlier, and these images are making us think about in those terms as well.
We need
So
that emoji for Facebook.
Yeah. So this is my object, and that's it. We're just opening for Q&A, and thank you.
All right, questions.
We have Jorge, Adrian, Jorge Garcia. There's another Jorge.
I have a question for you, Cristina. I really like this study of this pamphlet. And since you mentioned 1 was sent, it was like 4 copies, 1 was sent to Spain. Do you know if there was like a royal response to that? If there's any sort of like written correspondence, and if there was like a response from the royal court towards this pamphlet?
There was not really. I haven't found a response. There was like 6 months later, they sent another communication saying, we need you to take seriously that you have to follow the royal orders and you have to implement the royal decree, the Black Code. And I believe Venezuela is one of the few places that they started to release more information about the Black Code to masters and slave people, and to masters and overseers. And I think it's very interesting because at this point, I believe that Venezuelan authorities are debating between restricting information, but at the same time, enforcing planters and slavers to treat their slaves better, because if they don't, there could be consequences. And once Haiti exploded, they were saying that, you see, this is what happened when you don't control repression. So there's an act of balance between controlling information, but also encouraging masters and slavers to control their repression.
Have you seen this, the Código Negro, the response of the planters in Cuba to the Código Negro?
Yeah.
It's exactly the same as the Venezuelan.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what is do they go about the same way as they did in Venezuela?
They once Haiti went down, they decided to become like enslaved society, unlike the Venezuelan society, right?
Yeah, well, you can have slavery and still have a Código Negro.
Mm-hmm.
In terms that the state intervenes and the church, etc. So there's some mediation between the slave and the planter.
Yeah.
And regulate what is doable and what is not, or whatever. So the state can have access to tribunals and push back, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is rather whether Cuban planters or the Cuban governor or whatever, or the Audiencia of Santo Domingo decided to enforce or not the law.
They avoided the Código Negro. This is what Ada Ferrer says. So when I talked to Ada and I was working with this, I was like, it's surprising to see that in Venezuela they decided to slowly implement it, and at the end they're doing it. In Cuba, they were like, we're not going to do this. And we don't care if the Venezuelans are doing it.
Another thing about the reaction of the Código Negro in Cuba, when you read the responses of the planters, this organized response. It's only one on behalf of all the planters. I don't know whether that happens in Cuba, in Venezuela, but in Cuba they do. And one of the striking things about that, it's always and this is for Alex, it's always the comparative sociology of race and citizen and rights in relationship to the British.
Yeah.
We are different. We treat our blacks much better than the British do. Don't fear rebellion. They have access to rights. They have self-purchase. They have cortación. All this is bullshit. They already have rights. Do you find that as well in
That's
Venezuela?
in a way what they're doing, what they're saying.
The same comparative sociology of race and rights. We
They
debate,
say we don't need this
but
because we have been always benevolent.
no, but I
to-
mean, do they bring up the British or not?
They don't.
Okay.
I mean, I'm trying, now that I'm working on Trinidad, I'm trying to trace this because I think, maybe I have mentioned this to you before, but the thing is that in Trinidad, by 1781, between 81 and 85, all of the Grenadian planters who are moving from Grenada and the other Caribbean colonies to Trinidad, because Trinidad is inviting them to come, they're saying, we're gonna go, but you need a black coat. And those letters are going back to Spain. So I've seen, and I wonder if Trinidad is the first place that, in a way, made the Consejo de India think about the need to have a black coat, because they're asking for a black coat, and it was part of the negotiation between planters, French planters coming to Trinidad and the French government. So they implemented one temporarily in Trinidad even before 1789. And I'm trying to see the correlation between that first black coat, Trinidadian black coat, and the one that they created in Spain 5 years later. So I mean, I think there's a way we have to like track the history of the 1789 black coat, I guess. Yeah.
My question's actually fairly quick. Were there the same pictorial representations of the enslaved person holding a machete and basically a head of a white settler, a white planter in each of the pamphlets that you've seen, or was it specifically that one?
No, in the two that were collected, they're the same. I mean, it's not exactly the same because it seems like they have someone illustrating who couldn't do the same thing, but yeah, it's the same image.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And
I don't know about the other two because we only have two. I mean, we don't have the four. We only have two.
This is, what is the year?
17 is May 1790.
This is after the French Revolution.
Is after.
So they are current with the Bastille.
And are you seeing it as graffiti?
No, it was no graffiti. It was the paper put on the wall.
No, but the addition,
drawing,
the
yeah.
drawing.
It was a pencil. Yeah.
But somebody was reacting to it, right? Like.
We don't know.
Okay.
But it's part of,
Suspecting,
the.
I mean, it was part of the message,
Yeah.
but I mean, that's a good question. I wonder if the message was first in
Could have
ink.
been added later.
That's when
I
I
mean,
saw
but-
it, I was thinking graffiti, like somebody commenting,
Mhm.
like this is
Mm.
my reaction.
Like a marginal annotation of some
Yeah.
kind.
But it's probably not likely because if the two documents have the same graffiti.
Well, that's
it
what
makes
was,
sense.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, but
This is what I imagine, but I don't have, this is my conjetura, right? It's just like, so there's probably someone writing down the message,
Mhm.
and then Santiago, are you a good drawer? Can you put like a little slide there? And then he took the pencil and do that. I don't know. I mean, I have the feeling it was made in four hands. Like maybe the person writing is not the person making the illustration because they have a different, one has ink, the other one has pencil.
Mhm.
But I think it was inscribed on the paper because it was put at night. And the idea is that it was there in the morning. So I don't know if there was time for someone to respond. And
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I also just thinking also about the reaction. I mean, it just, how much of it is conjecture, how much do we know about the reaction immediately? Where you mentioned that's the hardest thing with this pieces of ephemera that we covered so much today is that we truly do not know what the reaction is. So I was talking to Alex earlier, I mean, about the notion of the newspaper. We can know from talking to people of the time, sure. From when these ephemera were produced and when they were published. But we cannot truly know so much as the wide impact of these documents as they were produced, as they were published, and how they were exchanged and how the ideas were exchanged. But I mean, it was really interesting hearing your personal take that maybe it was like several different groupings of individuals debating the document.
I mean, that's what the royals, that's what the officials wrote down. Like they were,
Oh,
they were concerned that by the time they removed the papers, there were circles of people talking about it.
Oh, okay, so that's
That's happening, yeah, it's
Okay.
recorded.
But what is striking is the document is respect, I mean, that there are no more graffitis on the document. That is what is striking.
Mhm.
I mean, one expects a reaction of kind of, I mean, like you are in a restroom and kind of, or sort of commentaries on the behavior, but there aren't.
People may not have been hearing.
Yeah,
those
how
sorts of
many-
Things with them.
One would have expected more the facing of the document, for instance, or instead of respect of the document. It seems like the community of those who are around the document are respecting the document.
Yeah, they didn't
Yeah.
yeah.
I have a question for Marlena, if I can, but I saw a minute, yeah, it's I wanted to know, Marlena, if there is any indication of where the book spent the first part of its life. And I'm curious about that in part because of the cochineal ink that you demonstrated and whether or not there are ways to think about, you know, its origin as well.
I'm muted, sorry. That's a great question. So I have thought about that a lot, especially because the vermilion and the cochineal being used together with the iron gall ink. And then I didn't get into this because the data couldn't really be brought together in a way that was sort of like scientifically viable to the Library of Congress. But they also found that the book had gesso on it, blot out some words that were mistakes, and clay, and a few substances that they actually could not identify. And so when that happens, basically the Library of Congress is really good for identifying like sort of popular pigments and of course anything that comes from Europe. But as soon as you sort of end up with something from the Americas, sort of from that period, there are things that they're missing. So there are certain pigments where they are not able to identify the chemical functional groups. So they don't know, it's not in their database. So together with the gesso and the clay and the unknown pigments, it kind of is giving me a vibe that this one came from like your scriptorium, for example, the one affiliated with Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco. But that's the thing I can't say 100%, just because, let me see if I can pull it up really quickly. Where is my PowerPoint? Did I actually close it? Well, so the title page also of the Arte has some provenance records that were defaced and scratched off, and those can't be retrieved either. So somebody bought this book, scratched it off, it was rebound, it was trimmed, it was rebound again. And so like now we have it. And so like, I would love to say that that's where it came from and the signs point that way, but I can't 100%.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alex and Jorge.
I just have a question for everybody in the panel, and I was just wondering if you can reflect a little bit on digitization and how digitization is affecting the way you and other scholars work with your objects. Everybody has a different object, so I'm really curious. And it's for everybody.
Who wants to go first?
I can start. I mean, it's super useful because you can zoom in on lots of details, but at the same time, it takes away the immediacy of the document. So for future people, my fear is that, I don't know if anybody's worked at the Bibliothèque Nationale, that they're not the most welcoming, maybe. So it makes me fear that because it's digitized, they won't let people see the original. And I feel like there's something lost when you don't see the original. So it's, you know, I think it's a great place to start, but then I always want to see the original as well. So hopefully it will diminish that chance.
We've seen an impact of that already, especially say with the land grant maps that were produced in New Spain in the 16th and 17th century, that they've been incorporated into UNESCO's Patrimony of the World, but that incorporation triggered a series of archival measures to take them out of circulation, precisely because they now have this new, kind of honorific, prestigious category, and so they can't really be used anymore. So you are automatically directed towards their digital platform, which is not particularly effective.
I was just, Andrea and I both are working, I'm head of preservation for the Humanities Research Center's collections, and Andrea is our senior book and paper conservator. And we struggle with these topics all the time, both in our trying to understand material and so that we can treat them properly, in terms of retreatment techniques and housing techniques. But this digitization question is really interesting. Most times digitization encourages use of the original. Almost always people want to come back and see the original. And so there's this weird line, that we find ourselves facing at times as preservation people, because we want these things to be around for another 500 years so that there can be reinterpretation going forward. So how many times can you drag it out, and there's no perfect answer to all of that. Like in our institution, we put, permission of curator. So the curator will come and talk with you and say, well, what are you trying to learn from the object? And most of the time the curator will bring it out for you. But Bibliothèque Nationale is well known for its restrictions.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting, it's one that I don't think we've all fully grappled with, but as scholars of materiality, keep pushing, just say you need to see it. Yeah. Because you do need to see it. It's important to see the original. It's what it's all about, right?
Well,
Jorge, I do want to say something. Jorge.
let's hear her.
Well, it's a question for you and for Lori. It's about the context of these. Whether there are any other additional documents around your codex, and it comes from the Biblioteca Nacional collection, which I think used to belong to Boturini, right? Most of this stuff is Boturini, and I grapple with some of these codices, and one of the striking things about that collection and many other collections, including Codex Osuna and many other codices of Genaro Garcia here, is the complete decontextualization of the document, right? In the files from where it came. Many of them came from litigation files or from visita files or whatever. And this is something that Diana Heredia is also struggling with, with documentation images of Cochineal, that these collections have orientalized these documents and become codices to a degree that they are just representations of nice pictographic cultural representations of different forms of writing, when in fact they were originally part of litigation or something, a larger paperwork genre. And in the case of Boturini, I think it's one of the initial traditions of decontextualizing the object in order to allegedly create a more modern history of indigenous documents. So the more you care for the document, the worse it is for the contextualization of the understanding of the document. So you create culture, you create indigenous culture that way, and the politics of the document is lost.
Yeah, and interestingly, with this document, the file in the Bibliothèque Nationale says it was not in Botturini's collection. So this one stands out even more because we know how Botturini went around and collected these manuscripts. So the fact that this one is not a part of that collection and still ended up.
But there isn't anything else. Okay, so
no, it's its own. And my suspicion is there's some text added to it that looks more like 18th century text. So my suspicion, and again, this is where we're just conjecturing, is that whoever owned this wanted to hold on to it as long as possible, and then something happened, and my sense is they sold it to somebody. And then it enters the sort of the system and enters institutions. But I can't prove that, but there's a really I didn't bring it in, sorry. Somebody added a text in there that's in a very kind of almost like a faux archaic language, like sort of dedicating it, saying like this book has been in our, I don't know, has been held for a number of years. And so my sense is that was like the last thing they added before perhaps selling it to a collector. But again, I'm totally speculating because we don't have the context, except for, to me, what they're writing on it, I think, like there's a mark of 1575 and then the establishment of a colegio. I feel like they are adding their own context to the work, but we don't have the institutional context.
And your boy has any context? It's just a thing there.
So we have the context of the guy, of the British guy who donated it to the British Museum in the 1840s. It's part of a collection. It does have a mummy associated with it and a few things. So it's, yeah, so the problem with pre-Hispanic and archaeological stuff in Colombia is that it's mostly been extracted and sold to museums. Even the Gold Museum in Bogota, there's no archaeological context for the majority of things, just because in the 19th century, starting in the 19th century and throughout this 20th century, archaeological stuff that used to be kind of, it wasn't worthless, but in the colonial period, Spaniards would take all the gold and just melt it and produce coin, right? And that's what they did with Atahualpa's bounty, right? That's in the 19th century, the archaeological pieces became valuable, and now just to sell them, it was more profitable. So we. Just to make the story short, it was these things were extracted probably by local people and sold to travelers, like this British guy, and then they brought it, and we only have the fact that he donated it. I think it was in the 1830s or 40s, the British Museum. So not much context. It hasn't been dated. We don't know if it's even pre-colonial or if it's colonial. I talked to the director of the Gold Museum in Bogota, who's done great work with gold. She's an archaeologist and had been training to see what of the collection can be actually look more colonial than pre-colonial. And she's almost certain that this textile might be colonial rather than pre-colonial. But that's just speculation based on her experience. So no context, basically.
So in your case, Alex, when mapas in Mercedes, etc., there's this tradition, I don't know whether it's 19th century, of creating the mapa and plano section of the archive that takes the document out of the
Rips
file.
them out of the file.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So did you find that in your own research, that you have the plano and the map, and then
Yes.
what do you do with it?
Yes, I did. Luckily, the archivists had been very diligent in connecting maps with cases.
Okay.
So it was not that difficult to tie them together. I think what I focused on a little bit more was precisely the point that you made. So these maps are ripped out of their original context at a different point and then individualized and placed in this collection, but it had nothing to do with how they were used. The maps would fall into any particular kind of range within the folio itself. It wasn't necessarily at the beginning or at the end. It could just be tucked in there depending on when the documents are being produced, but we never actually see that because you have to go and visit them on your own, and then you have to go and look for the case itself. There are a handful of these Mercedes maps that are still in their original folios, and that does allow us to kind of see that practice a little bit more, but they're limited. It's only, at least for the ones that I consulted, it was only maybe about 2 or 3.
I want to just jump back to the question about digitization. So this project, I think I confuse people because I have always been very pro digital humanities. Before Elon Musk kicked me off Twitter, my handle was digital history. But I'm obsessed with materiality. And so you always have to have both. Absolutely. I mean, there's no question. This project's own context created an interesting problem because we were supposed to be meeting April 2020 for in-person at 2 universities like this morning, where we were going to have a circus of objects and we were going to all talk together and analyze together and try and push the analysis. And then it was like, oh shit, none of us can get to the archive of where our objects are anymore. We can't come together in person. So it was forced into being born digitally. And so I think Glenda was like, shut it down. I can't do the computer. I don't know what to do. And I was like, we're doing this. And so one of the amazing things that happened first is everybody who was in the conference, I think we were 3 weeks into the pandemic, had to learn how to do not a digital presentation like this, but it film themselves so that we could watch each other's presentations and think about the objects critically, and then come together for a live conversation on Zoom. And so the tension between materiality and digitization has very much been at the center of this creation, which is a new creation of an archive, but also sort of the ethical questions of doing that. So if you look at the book, wherever it's floating around on the cover, that is basically a Hebrew lexicon that was carried around colonial America that has been rebound with an otter, what's the word, pelt, for lack of a better word, painted by Lenape tribe. And it was given to one of the pastors at Princeton, so which is why they painted it orange and black. And we had to think about and talk to tribes. I know, right? They're thinking about their colors like hundreds of years ago. We had to talk to Lenape and say, is it okay to put this online? Because there are all kinds of spiritual and community practices that you have to think through. And with my project this morning that I talked about, Darkology, I own thousands and thousands of these creepy ass books, and people are always like, oh, you're a digital historian, when do you make the website? And I'm like, no. Like, the Klan would love for me to put this stuff on the internet, but there's serious ramifications for doing that. And so thinking about access and layered access, all of the objects that are in this book had to receive permission from wherever the repositories were, and we had to make certain stipulations. There are 2 indigenous objects that are not on the website because of their requests, and they said, we really want people to know about this, we want them to understand it, but we don't want it on the internet. And we said, of course. And so that tension has always been there. Let's see if I had any other things I wanted to say about this. But yeah, I mean, like, what an example that I give with students when I'm teaching, it's like they think, oh, because you love digital history, we can just do all our research online. And I'm like, okay, so you're keyword searching in a newspaper and you find your article, but like, if you don't know that an antebellum newspaper is probably 4 feet and you have to read it and snap it, and like right by your article is like an abortion advertisement for some pill you can mail away for, you're missing like an enormous part of the context. And so that's why I say you have to have them both. Digitization is amazing because you can find objects that you wouldn't know about. I'm on the DPLA and Calisphere like all the time, but then I have to go in person if it's possible. And so we have a whole section in our acknowledgements about the weird process of trying to write about materiality in a historical moment in which we were not able to physically touch the objects. And Glenda and myself even being separated, it became this weird project where we were on a speakerphone and a Google Doc and like National Archives open, and it was just madness. But at the same time, the book endures. It's a physical object again. Yeah,
Well, I mean, y'all know, so little is online, really.
yeah, yes, of
I mean,
course.
There's just so
Yeah.
much, so you're only gonna encounter it if you come to the repository and have the luxury of having a few weeks to
Hmm.
make all those connections
Mhm.
that come by working in an archive. It made me start thinking about, the things we struggled with in our field, it's called like full digital capture.
Yeah.
Because early on, I was doing digital work back in the early nineties, believe it or not. And, you know, there was lots of fights about how many dots per, you know, how many pixels were we gonna afford this thing? And, you know, the preservation where people were pushing, no, go full, go big, you know, because it's people like you who study these things. You know, you can do a lot more with a high resolution TIFF image with your end user technology to really see some things that you can't even see with your naked eye
Mhm.
in
Like
a
Marlena's
reading
whole work,
room.
yeah.
If someone's not gonna bring you the microscope or the whatever. So, but I'm sure y'all are finding big variations in what you can get your hands on digitally,
Yeah.
in terms of quality.
Absolutely.
Because once it's done, I mean, it's like, there's so much to do, there's so much to digitize that it's rare that we actually go back.
Yeah.
And so some of that early stuff that was digitized, it will be another generation before it's ever digitized again.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me just end or say one thing, and so
You can have the final word.
I'll have the final
Reach the
word.
time, yeah.
So I have I have a digitization nonprofit that we established 10 years ago, and we're doing all kinds of digitization in endangered, low resource archives, mostly in Colombia, but also done projects in Peru, in Venezuela. And what I think is really important is I think, like, I'm not gonna repeat, but both things are important. But just the idea of the risk the manuscripts have that I don't know, the National Museum of Brazil burned a few years ago. Archives are in terrible conditions. There are lots of lost documents, and we in this room love close reading and material analysis, and we want to go and see the original. But there's lots of work that I don't think the documents need to be exposed to the dangers of the exposure of general researchers, even that. So the digitization, of course, it makes the documents widely available. Things like the Codex Mendoza I showed this morning. It's amazing the quality with which you can look at it online. And when I was in the Bodleian Library, I saw the actual codex. It was exhibited in under a closed glass frame that you could just see the first page, right? And you can do so much with that, right? So it's, yes, of course, it's nice to see the original, but the type of analysis I could do with the digitized material, it wasn't. Yeah, the digital archive of the National Archive in Colombia had a massive technological problem this past few years, and they lost all the documents they had online right when I was in the process of editing the final stage of the book.
Sorry, that's terrible.
It was impossible. And that's when I realized you start taking for granted the access to these documents that just because it's the overwhelming presence of the digital. But so it's a great privilege to get to see the original, but it's a very nice substitute to have the digitized material.
It's when you're getting down to the real materiality is when you've got to see the original. And I encourage y'all too to, I was really impressed with the collaboration with conservation scientists at the Library of Congress. We're all eager to collaborate, and we work with scholars in our labs too. And so I wanted to ask almost like, you know, how did she know? Or how did that happen that she actually got
She's
to
still
the-
there if you want
Is she there? Okay.
Yes.
Go for it.
How did it happen? If you came into contact with the conservation scientists at the Library of Congress, did you like bring a question up at the reference, to the reference people or to a curator, or how did that happen?
Yeah, so I was there through CLEAR, the Council on Library and Information Resources, and they supported me in setting me up with Vanilla France and the Preservation Research and Testing Division. Generally, their questions, I think if you were to pitch a question to them, they're generally interested in questions that allow them to collect more data about books and pigments for improved conservation efforts. So if you wanted to approach them, that would be the way to do it, with conservation and pigment identification, or more information about like a model as something that they would want to know about. Yeah. So
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah.
But I'm very interested. I'm also a scholar in American Studies, and I'm very interested in that conversation, that goes on between curators and scholars and conservators, and how that changes scholarship.
And it depends on the conservation lab and their capacity.
Oh, very much.
That's true,
Yeah.
the Library of Congress, but there might be other places where they're able to support research for research sake without the conservation.
Like we can't with that.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say the Library of Congress too, they would really be interested in the conservation side. They're not gonna just like, if you like hold up a piece of paper, like, what ink is this? They're gonna be like, why, what does that give us? Or like, what data can we collect from that? Like, why? Like it needs to be like a developed project, that's something that they can really sink their teeth into.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for
for everyone
coming and
stayed.
participating.
Yeah.
Yeah.